So welcome to Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace and prosperity in Europe. I'm very honored to have a very special American guest and a very special friend of Europe in America who has worked a lot on European economic reform as well already, Dan Mitchell, who is now the chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity in the US and has been before working in Heritage Foundation and in Cato Institute and is one of the leading tax reformers of the United States. Dan, I'm very happy that you joined this show. Can you please introduce yourself for the audience, please? Thanks a lot. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, it's great to be on the program with you. I think you touched on all the highlights of my career. I've been working in Washington for several decades, trying to convince the politicians not to tax and spend so much, which of course is what they like to do. So it's been a challenge, and it's going to get even more challenging in the future. I'm very worried about the fiscal future of the Western world.
You have worked as one of the few Americans who really care very much for Eastern European economic reform, and you have worked on many of the countries in Eastern Europe, from Poland to Serbia, Kosovo. I think you've seen all of the countries, you have spoken in all of the countries. And what is your most interesting tax reform? What is the tax model for Eastern Europe that you recommend?
Well, I'm a big believer in keeping marginal tax rates low on productive behavior. In other words, we don't want the tax code to punish people for working, saving, investing, being entrepreneurial. That's not a good idea. I also think it's important not to overtax or to have discriminatory tax burdens on saving and investing. So have low rates, only tax income one time, and obviously try to make the system simple. Now, if you do all of that, you basically have a flat tax. So I'm a believer in a flat tax, but I'm a believer in a flat tax not because there's some, it's not some magic amulet that you wear around your neck. If you had a flat tax but a rate of 80%, it wouldn't be a good idea. So I'm for a flat tax because that's simply a shortcut way of saying, I want low tax rates. I don't want any double taxation on saving and investing. And I want a simple, neutral system that's not filled with all sorts of corrupt loopholes for the friends of politicians. So I think the flat tax is the way to go. And of course, in Eastern Europe, we saw a very good period where lots of countries were adopting tax reform. They had escaped from the clutches of communism. They were experimenting with market-oriented policies so they could try to catch up. Unfortunately, we've had some backsliding in recent years, and some countries have reimposed discriminatory so-called progressive taxes. But it's still, the tax systems in Eastern Europe, on average, still tend to be better than the ones in Western Europe.
Let me ask you about the question Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, the three Baltic countries. How do you think has their tax system developed, and was it a success model, the reforms they did?
Well, it was Estonia back in 1993, 1994 was the first of the post-Soviet economies to adopt a flat tax. Latvia and Lithuania then copied them, but it wasn't just doing flat taxes. They also had a more market-oriented model of free trade, limited government, market-oriented competition. You had leaders there like Mark Lahr, who truly understood that if we're going to make up for the economic damage of decades of communism, we need a market-friendly model where people are free to earn income, compete, participate in the market economy. And then it sort of spread to other countries beginning in the early 2000s. You even had Russia doing it. You had Slovakia doing it. You had countries like Bulgaria and Romania doing it. So, and in the former Yugoslavia, several of the countries there did it. So it was spreading all throughout Eastern Europe as part of this sort of free market reforms that were being adopted in the aftermath of the wreckage of communism.
Especially one country which did a lot of reforms was Georgia after the so-called Rose Revolution. What's your impression about Georgian economic reforms?
Well, Georgia's been a great success story. One of the first things I always do when I want to look at how a country is performing is the Fraser Institute publishes Economic Freedom of the World. And that ranks countries. It measures their economic policy and it ranks them. And it measures them not just on tax policy, but also on the burden of government spending, on the regulatory burden. Are they open to free trade or are they protectionist? Do they have good quality rule of law? In other words, quality governance. Is the regulatory burden onerous or is it more free market oriented? And Georgia, if you look at the Economic Freedom of the World data, Georgia is one of the highest ranked countries in the world. And so if they can maintain those policies and not backslide, then we can be very optimistic. They've obviously already grown a lot since escaping communism. But the real goal, of course, is not just to grow, but to catch up. I think one of the most important economic concepts is the idea of convergence. And convergence means that if you're a poor country, you obviously want to catch up to a rich country. Well, that process doesn't happen automatically. It happens when you have good public policy. I mean, decades ago, Hong Kong and Singapore were relatively poor. Well, then they had free market policies, and for decades they had very rapid growth, and they caught up with Western countries. Not only that, but they passed them. Now, I'm not so optimistic about Hong Kong anymore, given what's happening there, but Singapore continues to be a very positive success story. And the recommendations I make when I speak in different countries around the world is that you should look at the countries that are rich, and most importantly, look at the policies that they had when they were rich and copy those policies. Because, and this is an important distinction. It might sound like I'm nitpicking, but let's take the example of Germany. Germany is a rich country by world standards. But when did it become rich? France is a rich country by world standards. When did it become rich? Well, countries in Western Europe became rich in the 1800s and early 1900s when the burden of government was very, very small. Now, once they became rich countries, and especially beginning in the 1960s, they adopted these big welfare states. Now they don't grow very fast anymore, but at least they became rich first and then adopted the welfare state second. So they might only have 1% growth now, but at least that's 1% growth from a high level. When I'm speaking in a country like Georgia, I tell them, if you want to copy France, go ahead, but copy France of 1875. Don't copy France of 2021, because France in 2021 has a tax code and a government spending burden and a regulatory apparatus that would keep Georgia from ever becoming a rich country. So I tell people all around the world, if you're going to copy a country today, copy Hong Kong, copy Singapore, don't copy, France or Germany, or don't even copy the United States, because we have too much government compared to what we had in the 1800s and early 1900s.
Let me ask you about Ukraine, because it's such a big and important country. And they have the flat tax, actually. They have together 19.5%. But do you think that's too high level of flat tax for the status of development and economic prosperity of Ukraine?
The problem in Ukraine is not the tax burden, at least not the income tax burden. I mean, payroll, you have to look not just at the income tax. In some countries, you have very onerous social insurance, or what we in America call payroll taxes. But I don't think the fiscal policy is the problem in Ukraine. It's the regulatory burden. It's the rule of law. Again, look at Economic Freedom of the World. You'll see that Ukraine is ranked very low. And if you look at the different measures in Economic Freedom of the World, they measure fiscal policy, regulatory policy, trade policy, so on and so forth. You'll see where Ukraine is doing the worst. And obviously, think about it like if you're a student in school and you're taking math, you're taking history, you're taking language. Well, if you're failing two courses, those are the two courses you need to spend most time studying. And if Ukraine is getting a B or a C in fiscal policy, but it's getting an F in other policies, that's where it needs to concentrate its efforts and fix those. Obviously, I'll never argue if Ukraine wants to cut its tax rates. That would be a good thing for growth. But if a Ukrainian politician were to ask me, what's the one thing we should do today? We only have time to do one thing today. What should it be? It's probably not going to be cut tax rates, because there are some public policies where Ukraine is doing much, much worse than it's doing on fiscal policy. So I'm a great fan of the flat tax, but it's not a silver bullet. If you have really bad policies in other areas, yes, it's great that you have a flat tax, but you're not going to have rapid growth if you have really bad policies in other areas.
Let me ask you about Romania, because they have a 10% flat tax, but in corporation tax, they are still at 16%. Do you think it's better to have the same level of corporation tax and income tax?
Sometimes for simplicity reasons, it's good to have the same rate. Now, I don't know the inner details of the Romanian tax system, but in the United States, for instance, we sometimes have issues where people can incorporate and other people, though, they don't incorporate and they simply report their business income on the personal tax code. And so in the United States, there's a reason to try to equalize the rate, given the way that people have the choice of opting for the corporate tax or the personal tax when they file their returns. Since I don't know the details of how the Romanian tax system works in terms of that kind of choice to opt into one or the other, I don't know how important it is, but yes, as a matter of simplicity and oftentimes as a matter of administrative, just having a well-designed tax system, it would be good to have the same rate for both, but it's really important if taxpayers can choose which one to be in, then maybe it's more important than in other cases.
We have also very good tax system in Bulgaria with 10% flat tax for corporate and for income. And now we have also, it's the first ever that the Bulgarian former Minister of Finance and EU Commissioner is also the head of the International Monetary Fund. And do you think that she will promote now in her new position the Bulgarian success model of 10% taxation, or the IMF will continue to spread progressive ideas and progressive taxation globally?
Unfortunately, what I've seen so far is that even though Bulgaria has a pretty good tax system, the IMF is still spreading the message of higher taxes, more punitive class warfare type taxes. The IMF, this is an issue where I am so disappointed, because if you go back from, say, the period 1980 to about 2000, you had what was called the Washington Consensus, where even some of these international bureaucracies were pushing good advice on countries. They were recommending to the transition economies and to the developing countries in places like Africa and Latin America and Asia, they were recommending lower tax rates, control government spending, free trade, deregulation. So historically, I don't like international bureaucracies, just because I'm just not a fan of government. But the international bureaucracies were doing good work back then. Heck, the World Bank was a leading voice in the fight for good pension reform, creating personal retirement accounts instead of unfunded, bankrupt tax and transfer systems that many governments were relying on. But sadly, that Washington Consensus that you saw with the IMF and the World Bank pushing for good reforms, good free market reforms around the world, that doesn't exist anymore. The IMF especially is really conducting economic malpractice by pushing tax increases in so many countries around the world. And unfortunately, even though there's now a Bulgarian in charge, and even though Bulgaria has a good tax system, that good Bulgarian tax policy is not the model that the IMF is using. Now, maybe she's fighting to get some good policy, but I see no evidence of that so far. I hope to be proven wrong at some point.
Then let me ask you, because we had very big success actually in Bulgaria with informality reduction and with higher tax revenues because of the 10% taxation. That was really very good. But one thing which is not perfect in Bulgaria it's still not member of the OECD. The same also with Romania and Croatia and also Cyprus, because they are member of the European Union already since 2007 and 2013, or 2004 respectively, but unfortunately not in OECD, and that's quite surprising. And we have now a new Director General, Matthias Kormann. He was just appointed elected, I think, 2 weeks ago. He will in July start. Do you think that it is will be more open, the OECD, and will be also more open for low tax countries, reform countries from Eastern Europe? Or it will
Well,
stay
the OECD,
a group of rich countries?
yeah, the OECD, for people watching this, is an international bureaucracy largely comprised of North America, Western Europe, and Pacific Rim countries. But they have broadened out. They have some Latin American countries like Chile and Colombia. I think they brought in South Africa, although I suppose I should double check that. And some Eastern European countries. Some countries that have observer status. So maybe that's where South Africa stands. Now, I don't like the OECD because even though it was created as a free market alternative to the Soviet bloc back in, I think, the early 1960s, the OECD has become very much pro-tax harmonization. It's giving the same poisonous economic tax advice as the IMF. So in some sense, I want countries to stay as far away from the OECD as possible. But of course, the way you're asking the question is, well, maybe if we got some good countries in the OECD, maybe that would reduce the pressure and the arguments for tax increases that come from that Paris-based bureaucracy. That's a hard question to answer. Can the OECD be reformed from within so it's more friendly to free markets? I'm skeptical. As far as I'm concerned, I want the US government to pull out of the OECD. We give them, what, $100 million roughly a year in taxpayer subsidies from American taxpayers. We're giving it to a bunch of bureaucrats in Paris to push for higher taxes around the world. And oh, by the way, OECD bureaucrats get tax-free salaries. So it's really, in my mind, just disgusting and reprehensible that you have this bureaucracy filled with overpaid tax-free bureaucrats jetting around the world to try to push countries to raise taxes and to try to undermine tax competition. In effect, what they're trying to do is create an OPEC for politicians. But instead of trying to conspire to keep oil prices high, they're conspiring to keep taxes high. And of course, the European Commission in Brussels tries to do the same thing. And so whenever you get a bunch of government people together, I always worry they're going to try to create cartels to benefit politicians rather than to push good policy that will help economies grow and create jobs for people.
Some people in Eastern Europe think that the reason why Romania and Bulgaria have not been allowed into the OECD is because they had a very competitive low tax system and they were competing so heavily with the high tax countries of France and Germany. And so maybe to get them integrated would be a good next step to reform OECD away from a tax cartel. Do you think that's possible with the new leadership?
Well, I don't know anything about the new Secretary General, so I can't really comment on that. But obviously, if Romania and Bulgaria join the OECD, I hope that there'll be a voice for more economic rationality. But here's the problem. Who dominates economic policy? The countries that contribute the most money. Well, the US, now under a Biden administration that's very left-wing, the US is going to be pushing for left-wing policies at the OECD. France and Germany have always been pushing for left-wing policies at the OECD. It's going to be very hard for countries like Romania and Bulgaria, who are maybe contributing 1% of the budget at most. It's going to be very hard for them to move the OECD in a more free market, low tax direction. If they join, I want them to fight for that. But I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna be very hopeful that it'll make a difference. Now, obviously, especially to the extent that the European Commission is trying to harmonize taxes upward, which would force Romania and Bulgaria to have a worse tax system and make them less competitive. You know, Romania and Bulgaria need a voice to protect them because they're trying to do what we talked about earlier. They want to converge. They want to get richer. They want more jobs and prosperity for their people. And to the extent that the OECD and the European Commission and the IMF are pushing the high tax, high tax, high tax message over and over and over again, Romania and Bulgaria need to resist that, not to mention, Cyprus and other countries as well. I mean, if the international bureaucracies and the high tax countries succeed in creating global tax cartels, that's going to basically freeze in place the uncompetitive low income countries and make it very, very difficult for them to economically rise.
Let me ask you also about Greece, because that's a country very dear to your heart. I think you have been many times and also very much following the Greek debt crisis. Do you think when Greece would have listened to your advice in the early 2000s, when there was a conservative government, to really significant cut the taxes towards 15 or 10%, much of these troubles in the 2008 and 2012 could have been avoided?
I think a more competitive pro-growth tax system like a flat tax would have been beneficial for the Greek economy. But I want to go back to a point we already discussed. If all you have is good tax policy, that's not going to save your economy. Greece also needs spending restraint. And the model that I think not only Greece, but other countries all around the world, including the United States, should be adopting is to copy Switzerland. Switzerland has a spending cap. It's called the debt brake, but it basically is a spending cap. It limits the growth of the Swiss budget to about 2% a year. And why is that a good thing? Well, because in the average year, nominal GDP is probably going to grow 4 or 5%, and real GDP will grow maybe 2 or 3%. Well, if nominal GDP is growing 4 or 5% a year, your revenues are probably going to grow 5 or 6% a year. So if spending is growing 2% a year, and your economy is growing 4 or 5% a year in nominal terms, guess what happens? You're slowly reducing the burden of government spending as a share of GDP. And because revenues roughly grow with GDP, you're also reducing your deficits and debt. And so the Swiss spending cap, again, called a debt brake, that policy has enabled Switzerland's finances to be very, very strong, while all of its neighbors are having more and more spending, more and more debt, which of course leads to more and more pressure for higher taxes. Switzerland's in very strong shape. And so I think if Greece not only had reformed its taxes and adopted a flat tax, but also put in place a Swiss-style spending cap, we never would have had the fiscal crisis. You never would have had the economic collapse, all the misery, all the joblessness, all the emigration of young people because they see no hope. All that could have been avoided with some good policies, just like 5 to 10 years earlier. And that's really a message that also applies for, say, Italy today. Italy is heading toward a Greek-style crisis. Now, obviously, if the European Central Bank continues to subsidize Italian debt, maybe they can push it off for several years. But at some point, that house of cards in Italy is going to collapse unless there's some sort of combination of a Swiss-style spending cap to control the spending side of the budget, mixed in with those good pro-growth tax reforms that you and I have both been arguing for I don't we met each other 20 years ago or something like that. We've been banging the drum for pro-growth tax policy, all that time. But it does have to be mixed with spending control, not to mention deregulation, free trade, rule of law, and all the other policies that enable a country to score highly in the Fraser Institute's economic freedom of the world.
There's new Prime Minister, Mr. Mario Draghi, the former central bank governor from the European Central Bank. He was just recently appointed to be the Prime Minister of Italy. Are you optimistic that he can turn around Italy, because it's now already at 140% of GDP in debt ratio, and it's in a deep crisis now, Corona? Do you think he can turn the ship around?
I'm not optimistic because I don't think uh, I don't even the center right parties, which theoretically are the ones that should be pushing market oriented reforms and spending restraint. Uh, I haven't seen evidence that they're really committed. Not to mention, do they even have the votes? When you have the 5-star populists and things like that, yeah, Italy needs an election where you sweep into power people that are committed to actually fixing the problems, lowering the tax rates, controlling government spending. I worry that Draghi might be more of a technocrat who simply looks at the numbers on a spreadsheet and says, we have a deficit. Maybe we should raise taxes. Well, that's like a dog chasing its tail. You raise the taxes, that weakens the economy. I mean, maybe they actually collect more revenues, but they'll never collect as much additional revenue as they think because of the Laffer curve. Some people won't work as much. Some people will avoid and evade taxes. Some companies will move. I mean, there are all sorts of things that all sorts of negative effects of higher tax rates that sometimes these politicians and technocrats don't understand, or maybe they understand it, they simply don't care.
Let me guide you again towards the other side of the Adriatic and to these reform economies of Macedonia, Kosovo, and Bosnia. You have been in all of them, and actually you have seen that the 10% tax model is really allowing more creativity, more innovation, more growth, even from a very low level start. Actually, it's possible. And what do you think about this 10% taxation model for the transition economies in Southeastern Europe?
I think it's great news that a lot of them have adopted flat taxes and they're keeping tax rates low. But again, what about social insurance taxes? Are they too high? What about the regulatory burden? Are they controlling government spending? There's more than one policy if you want the rapid growth Hong Kong, Singapore model in your country. And if you look at those Southeast Europe economies and you look at where they rank in the Fraser Institute's economic freedom of the world, none of them are in the top 25. Georgia's in the top 25. The Baltic countries, at least a few of them are in the top 25. But if you're ranked below Germany or France in terms of your overall economic policy, you're probably not going to be a rapid growth, what's called sometimes a tiger economy. To be a tiger economy, you need not just the low tax rates, you need some of the other reforms as well. So yes, I'm delighted that they have flat taxes in some of these jurisdictions. I think that's great for their economies. It's great in terms of reducing tax avoidance. It's great for reducing tax evasion. It's great for promoting entrepreneurship. But it's just like if you have an A in your history class, but you're flunking your other classes in school, your GPA, as we call it, your grade point average, it's not going to be very good. So yes, keep those good tax reforms, but build on them by adopting some of the other policies that will enable fast growth.
There's one country which had already 10% flat tax, that was Albania. But unfortunately, you talked also about the situation of a backsliding, the danger of backsliding. And then in 2014, they have increased the taxes from 10 to 15, and also then the progressive taxation to a top level of 23. That might not sound a lot, but it was a huge tax increase from 10%. Can you say that about the danger of backsliding when things are good and then you have a cut in growth again?
Well, it's not just Albania. Slovakia and the Czech Republic backslid. I think 2 of the 3 Baltic countries backslid and now have so-called progressive, but what I call discriminatory income tax systems. I think that's very unfortunate. I think it's very unfortunate that the OECD and the IMF and the European Commission are pushing for countries to get rid of their flat taxes. I think it's very unfortunate that that you get class warfare creeping into these countries. I mean, they lived under a communist system that was based on class warfare. So you would think that they realized that that's a poisonous ideology. It's an ideology of stagnation. It's an ideology of envy. It's an ideology of hate. And especially if you're a poor country trying to catch up with rich countries, you can't afford to dabble with that kind of destructive ideology of class warfare. Now, as you point out, they're not adopting 50%, 60%, 70% tax rates. So some of them still have reasonably attractive income tax systems. But I think one of the reasons why a single rate flat tax is good is that it sends a signal to the investors of the world, the job creators, the people who are deciding where they're going to build factories, where they're going to invest money. A flat tax is a signal that this is not a country that practices class warfare. Because once a country starts adopting discriminatory tax rates, if you're an investor, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're deciding where to build a factory, well, you don't know, are they going to take that 23% rate and next year make it 33 or 43? And especially in the current political environment where you have some of the really crazy left-wing ideas are back in fashion of punitive tax rates, of confiscatory fiscal systems. I just think once you move away from having one tax rate and you start having discriminatory rates, I think investors and entrepreneurs can't trust that country as much because you don't know whether a so-called reasonable tax rate will become a confiscatory tax rate, 1 year from now or 5 years from now. And when you're thinking about investing and building a business and building a factory, you're not just thinking of 1 year, you're thinking of 20 years, 30 years. And so it's very important to send the right signal that this country is not a class warfare country. This country is not going to try to confiscate your earnings. This country is going to welcome job creation, welcome prosperity. And I think the flat tax is a very important signal to attract wealth and opportunity and jobs to your country.
Let me ask you about the Slovak economic miracle of the beginning of the 90s, because it was amazing. Suddenly so much foreign direct investment, the automotive sector developing, because Ivan Miklos and Mr. Chorindo, his prime minister, they introduced this 19% flat tax in Slovakia. What's your take on that?
Slovakia was a great success story. Now it's not a bad country now. It still is reasonably market oriented, but unfortunately, some of the good reforms have been weakened, and getting rid of the flat tax was, I think, a big mistake. Now I think at least the last time I checked, the top tax rate is only 25 or 26%. So it's not a terrible country. I wish we had a top tax rate in America of 25 or 26%. But the fact that it's no longer a 19% flat tax, how much confidence does a business owner or an investor have that tax rate will stay 25 or 26% in Slovakia? Again, I think the flat tax is not just the economic benefits, it's also the political signal that we don't practice class warfare. Because you never know, if there's no longer a flat tax, all it takes is one bad election where a bunch of socialist or class warfare parties or populist parties take over, and all of a sudden, you have Bernie Sanders type policies where you're suddenly raising tax rates to 50 or 60 or 70%. So I think the flat tax is not just a good economic policy, it's a commitment that you're sending to the world's investors and entrepreneurs that this is a jurisdiction that is committed to low taxes and a business-friendly, job-friendly environment.
Recently, Hungary has changed to a 9% corporation tax level and to a 15% income tax level. What do you think about the Hungarian economic model?
The tax system is good, at least the income tax system. I don't know right offhand what the social insurance taxes are, because in some Eastern European countries, you can have social insurance taxes of 20, 30% or even more. So even if your flat tax is at a low rate, you're still imposing a very high tax on workers and job creation. And I don't know what Hungary does in that regard. But here's where I'll say I am familiar with some numbers. The burden of government spending in Hungary is too big. And unless Orban and the other political leaders in Hungary adopt some sort of Swiss-style spending cap, I worry that that government just being too big over time is going to lead to pressure for higher tax rates. And so, yes, the income tax system in Hungary is good. It should be applauded. It's no doubt being very helpful to job creation and prosperity. But so long as government is consuming too much of the economy's output, there's always that long-term danger that tax rates will go up. And so I would like to see some commitment to spending restraint on the part of the Hungarian government, because just like a flat tax is a signal to the world's entrepreneurs and investors of good economic policies, I think a flat tax married to some sort of Swiss-style spending cap would really be a powerful 1-2 punch that a country like Hungary could use to attract even more job creation and more prosperity in the future.
On Slovenia and Croatia, they have basically copied the Austrian social democratic model, and they have kept progressive taxation relatively high. Slovenia actually, similar to Austria, above 50% of progressive taxation. Do you recommend to change and adopt a more competitiveness and open economic model?
Yes, Slovenia and Croatia have been the more disappointing of the countries in Southeastern Europe, in that they haven't really done a lot of good supply side style low tax reforms, and I think that's holding them back. I mean, imagine if you're with a major company and you're thinking where to build a factory, and you have Slovenia and Croatia with higher tax rates, and then right next door, countries with lower flat taxes. Well, to me, it's kind of obvious. You're going to build your factory and create jobs where the tax burden is lower. Yeah. Now, obviously, taxes are not the only determinant of where factories get built and where jobs get created. You're looking at labor costs. You're looking at the regulatory burden. You want to make sure that there's open trade, so you're not being hit with any trade taxes or import barriers or things like that. But again, I think Slovenia and Croatia, it's been disappointing that they have never really had sort of a Mart Laar, even Miklos type free market reformer to really drive good policy in those countries.
In the 90s, Poland was such a real reforming country, but then actually in the 2010s, it has joined a little bit of a confused economic policy. While taxes are still low, they have now 2 levels of income tax, one for domestic SMEs at 9% and one for foreign investors at 19%. What do you think about this kind of economic taxation policy?
For principles of fairness, I think it should be the same rate on all people, on all businesses, and that rate should be low. Now, 9 and 19, those are reasonably low rates. But as a matter of economic policy, your domestic SMEs are domestic. They can't really move. So if you impose a higher rate on the companies that can move, that, normally when governments discriminate, they discriminate in the other direction. They discriminate in favor of the more mobile businesses, because they realize those businesses can decide, well, I'll be in Estonia instead. I'll be in the Czech Republic instead. I'll be in Ireland instead. Now, I appreciate the fact that sometimes governments discriminate in favor of their own businesses as opposed to international businesses. But you would think that the government of Poland would realize it would be a good idea to have tax rates low on both types of companies. But again, I don't want to sound too critical, because a 19% rate compared to what we have in the United States, it's better. And of course, Joe Biden wants to raise our rate up to 28%. And then, of course, you add in about 5% for state corporate taxes. So we're moving in the wrong direction. And so sometimes I get jealous when I see some of these countries in Eastern Europe that have low rates, because they at least understand you don't want to penalize job creation and investment.
Before you get too jealous about our tax system, let's discuss about the Austrian and German situation. Especially Germany is the most important economy in Europe with 83 million people and also such a big 4 trillions of GDP. And the question about tax reform is a 20 years old battle. I know you have been very active also to promote tax reform in Germany. And now we have elections again. And Germany has actually abolished at least the solidarity tax to finance the unity. But the question is, do you think that Germany should also be more competitive in the global economy?
Given Germany's size, it would be really good for Germany to say lower its corporate tax rate to 20%, because other countries would be forced to respond simply to stay competitive. I mean, the German industry is very productive, very efficient, but it is hampered by a high tax burden. So if you suddenly lowered that tax burden with just the inherent dynamism and efficiency of German industry, that would put a lot of pressure on countries around the world to start moving back in the right direction. The way I think about it is we had a very good pro-tax competition period in the world between, say, 1980 and about 2008. Reagan and Thatcher started it by slashing tax rates. And then, of course, other countries like Ireland contributed. But, once that process started, countries all over the world had to cut tax rates to stay competitive. They had to adopt flat taxes. That was a wonderful period. And of course, governments hated it. Politicians didn't like having to lower taxes to stay competitive. And that's why they got the OECD to launch their anti-tax competition project. That's why the European Commission has been trying so hard to harmonize taxes, because tax harmonization, it always means harmonize at high levels, not at low levels. Anti-tax competition is designed to enable high tax rates, not low tax rates. So we had that great period of about 3 decades where tax rates were being lowered around the world because tax competition was very much alive. But ever since then, the OECD has partially succeeded with its campaign to stamp out tax competition. The IMF is relentlessly pushing higher taxes around the world. The European Commission still wants to harmonize taxes above and beyond what they've already done with things like value-added taxes and excise taxes. So we need something to sort of go back on the offensive. It would be so great if Germany adopted a big cut in corporate taxes. And of course, it would be great to have a big cut in personal taxes as well, because we need some pressure to keep governments elsewhere from adopting bad policy.
The historic Paul Ryan-inspired tax cut of 2017 in the US had some impact in Europe as well on the countries which are more connected with the United States, on Belgium, on the Netherlands, on Sweden, on the United Kingdom, and especially, and also on Ireland, but that had already low taxes. But especially Belgium has now recently reduced its taxes to 25% from 30%. That was a big step. Do you think there will be other countries following this lower tax situation from the US?
Well, I'm worried about that. We already have seen now the United Kingdom is going to raise corporate tax rates. That's
No.
a big mistake, a big mistake. And if Joe Biden succeeds in raising the corporate tax rate in the United States, then what's the pressure? Where will the pressure be for countries in Europe to start lowering tax rates again? I worry that they'll be raising tax rates. Remember, politicians all around the world would love to have sort of a cartel where they all agree to have high tax rates, because then that gives them more power over their economies. At least on paper, it gives them more revenue that they can use to buy votes with through the budget process. So I'm a little bit pessimistic now. I normally try to be hopeful, but with some of Biden's class warfare taxes, and then Boris Johnson making this big mistake with a higher corporate tax rate in the United Kingdom, I don't know. I guess we just have to hope maybe the German elections somehow lead to a tax-cutting government, although I don't quite see that happening, because even if the Christian Democrats stay in charge, I don't see any major supply side block that's going to push through lower tax rates. But hopefully you can tell me I'm wrong.
There is the hope that the Liberals will also join a coalition government in September, October 2021, and maybe also to drive tax reform as one of the issues for a more competitive and more modern Germany. Because in the Corona crisis, they have a big discussion now that Germany is not a very modern country, and so maybe to change that taxation level as well.
And by the way, we should point out for Americans who might be viewing this discussion, liberal in Germany means free market. You're referring, of course, to the Free Democratic Party, which is considered the liberals, but liberal means liberal in the Adam Smith classical liberal sense, not the American definition of liberal, which is very statist, big government, high tax oriented. So when people in Europe say liberal, it generally means a good thing, free market, low tax,
Yes.
Whereas in the United States, liberal has the exact opposite meaning.
Yeah, thanks for this. It's absolutely correct to also explain it to the audience. Let me also then ask me about the United Kingdom, because the idea of Brexit was to create some kind of Singapore and the Thames, a very free market, very competitive, a country with low taxation, low regulation, and also with a free trade agreement with the United States. Can you talk about, will it be happening? Will it be this kind of Singapore on the Thames?
Right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be saying it's going to be Paris on the Thames with Johnson raising the corporate tax rate. I mean, the problem, I think, is that Boris Johnson is a bit of a populist in the same way that the Law and Justice Party in Poland is populist, in the same way that Trump was populist. And populists don't like controlling government spending. I mean, they're not class warfare leftists. They don't want higher taxes just for the sake of having higher taxes, like some of our crazy left-wing friends have that view. But they do like government spending. And in the long run, if government spending is going up, taxes are going up too. And of course, the United Kingdom had a lot of emergency spending for the coronavirus. And I think that's what drove Boris Johnson and as Chancellor of the Exchequer to raise tax rates. So I'm not giving up. I'm still hopeful that once coronavirus ends, then maybe they'll lower tax rates, begin to control government spending, but it's not a good start. It's not a good start to the post-Brexit world for the United Kingdom. And of course, now with Joe Biden in the White House, he's just as much of a protectionist as Trump was. So we're probably not going to get a quick free trade agreement, or even if it is a trade agreement, it won't really be free trade. It'll have a lot of regulatory harmonization and other restrictions that undermine the potential benefits. Now, you and I, of course, have had discussions over the years about whether the European Union is a pro-market entity or an anti-market entity. And I was in favor of Brexit because I think the European Commission is becoming increasingly statist in its orientation. And so, in other words, the EU, which started out as a very good idea for a free trade group, has now become more of a harmonization, bureaucratization, centralization entity. I would hope that I'm wrong on that, but I do worry with what they agreed to with what some people call Corona bonds, the debt mutualization. That agreement last year, I think, was a very bad step. I do worry the European Union is going to become a transfer union. And so I think even if the UK doesn't do good policies now that they're independent, I think in the long run, the rich countries of the EU are going to be subject to a transfer union that's going to increase the burden of redistribution and taxes. So I'm still not a big fan of the EU, although I hope that events will prove me wrong.
In that case, we have to discuss what Paris and France wants, because now the UK is leaving, has left. It's of course a much stronger French Europe in many ways. At least the Paris elite wants that. And let me ask you about the French economic model, about the French taxation model. What do you think about the success of Macron up to now and all the issues connected with Paris?
Macron, I think, in his heart, realizes that France has to liberalize its economy. And at least on the margin, he is propose some domestic reforms that would be beneficial for the French economy. But I don't think well, let me put it this way. France needs to do this much reform. Macron is doing this much reform. And France, like a lot of other European countries, has long-run demographic pressures of an aging population and fewer new taxpayers entering the system because birth rates are low. And so the pressure in the long run will be for the burden of government spending in France to go even higher. And of course, it's already one of the worst countries in the world for the burden of government spending. France right now has the highest corporate tax rate, I believe, in all of Europe. So there's a lot of reforms that need to happen in France. Macron, I think, understands that some of those reforms need to happen, but he's not doing nearly enough. And who knows what will happen with the next French election. And that's domestically. In terms of European-wide debates, Macron is in favor of more centralization in Brussels, not less. Maybe because he thinks that more centralization will mean that German taxpayers are paying for French benefits. I don't know.
In Europe, we have 27 member states. Many of them we have discussed also, and we have very different ideas about economic policy, from Estonia, which is very free market country, to Greece, which obviously needs more support, to France, which was more centralism, to most of the new member states, from Bulgaria to Poland, which want a more competitive Europe ultimately. Now the question is, because most Europeans very much like a Biden government, because the hope is that Biden will be more active to help us to be somehow more competitive and also to be more united with America and not with France, because we have only France now as a big power left in the EU, and Germany is not willing to take that responsibility. So many people hope that Biden will help us actually to reform the economies of Europe into a more open market. That sounds very strange for American viewers. I understand that. We also hoped very much about the transatlantic trade agreement in order to have this American model of economic reform closer in Europe. So I understand it's not very common idea, but do you think that Biden will be more active in European unification and European free trade?
Biden will be more pro-European, but not in a way that I think will be helpful. Because Biden's Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, is very much on the left. And so she'll be in favor of OECD and IMF tax raising efforts. She'll be supportive of European Commission tax harmonization efforts. Not that she'll have a major voice in that, but she'll certainly have a major voice in the IMF and OECD on their the pressure that they impose for higher taxes around the world. And if we have a free trade agreement with Biden and the EU, it's not going to be a free trade agreement. It's going to be an agreement to have regulatory harmonization and things like that. It's not going to be the mutual recognition model that you originally had in the EU that was very good. It's going to be regulatory harmonization, which of course is where Brussels has been heading anyhow. So we'll all agree to have high tax rates and high levels of harmonization, and we'll maybe reduce trade taxes by that much. No, that's not a step in the right direction. I worry that free trade agreements are now being taken over by extraneous factors that lead to more statism in economies, and that worries me. I mean, most people in the world, you and I know what mutual recognition is, but most people in the world don't know what it is, and it's a very important component of a competitive, free trade oriented, low regulation model, because what mutual recognition basically says is that, well, Bulgaria can have its laws on regulation and labor laws and things like that, and France can have its laws, but any French person can buy whatever they want in Bulgaria, any Bulgarian person can buy whatever they want in France. That's a competitive model. It's competitive federalism, you could maybe call it. That mutual recognition model is very, very good, but that's exactly what the left wants to get rid of. And they want to use free trade agreements to get rid of that mutual recognition model. So well, I'm pessimistic on a lot of issues, as you know, but I'm getting more pessimistic on free trade agreements as being a hopeful way of creating more growth in the world, because our friends on the left want to use free trade agreements as a vehicle to sort of bring an end to mutual recognition and instead have regulatory harmonization.
Still, it's the dream of our side of the Atlantic to have this free trade agreement with the United States of America one day. So the hope is there, and I hope for that. Let me ask you the question about the tax reform, because that was a lot of positive energy in 2017 when America cut the corporate taxation to 21%. Obviously, in Europe, unfortunately, there's a lot of negative talk about this tax reform, but it seems to be a very positive forward step for growth in America, and has also led to some degrees of corporate taxation in Europe and some other countries in the world. Is there now, is this decided to raise the corporate taxation? Is there enough majority in the US Senate for 28%? And do you think that will really come?
The Democrats and Republicans are tied in the Senate 50 to 50. But that means that the vice president, Kamala Harris, has a tie-breaking vote in our system. The House, the Democrats have a margin of like 5 seats. So if the Democrats stay 100% unified, they can pass a lot of things, including a 28% corporate tax rate. Now, the question, of course, why would they want to do that? When we did the lower corporate tax rate in 2017, the economy really picked up. As a matter of fact, in 2019, we had a record increase in household income. We had a record reduction in the poverty rate. We had record low unemployment, including in the Black and Hispanic community. We were seeing some very strong results. Now, of course, coronavirus then hit, and the economy went down like it did in every country where it had an effect. And so that sort of has created maybe a more of a muddled picture where people don't understand how well the economy was doing before the coronavirus hit. And so would the Democrats, with their control of Washington, both the presidency and Congress, will they really undo the crown jewel of the 2017 tax reform? And I hope not, but so far, not a single Democrat in either the House or the Senate has said, no, I will not go along with that. Now, if you were to ask me to make a prediction, I don't think they'll get to 28%, but I do worry that they'll raise the rate to 25 or 26%, which then if you add in the 4 to 5% average of corporate tax rates, the corporate tax rate in America will be close to 30%, which is very unfortunate because right now we're already above the world average, and this would push us, maybe not as bad as France, but we would have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. And if you add in the double taxation of dividends, which is a problem in the United States, and of course Biden wants to make it worse by raising the rate on that and raising the capital gains tax rate as well, the US will have unquestionably the worst business tax system in the entire developed world. And that's going to be bad news for the workers of America.
In 2018, 2019, we have seen significant capital outflows of Europe into America because of this lower taxation and enormous growth rates. You think that after the end of the corona crisis in 2022, hopefully, there will be this kind of growth phase again, picking up significant growth, and Europe again, like in the 2010s, it was also the problem of Europe that we have really been left behind in overall growth rate. In GDP capita, we were significantly worse performing than the United States of America. Do you think that pattern will be repeated?
Well, that's a point that we should elaborate on because it's very important. We talked earlier in our discussion about convergence. Well, in theory, because the United States is richer than most countries in Europe, in theory, Europe should grow faster and sort of narrow the gap. And that did happen after World War II. Europe narrowed the gap a lot. But then about when Reagan got in the US and shifted our policy in a more free market direction, ever since then, the gap has been widening where the US is growing faster than Europe on average. Obviously not every single year, but if you take long run averages, the US has been outperforming Europe. And that's because we have, on average, more economic freedom than you find in European countries. Now, Joe Biden wants to move us to the left. He wants to make the US more like France, more like Italy, more like Greece. But he's not going to be able to do it all at once. So if Europe continues to have bad policy and we have some bad policy, but not as bad, yeah, the US will probably grow faster. Now, one thing that you'll see in the short run, we have a giant increase in savings in the United States because people haven't been able to spend money on many things. Not to mention the fact that government has just been giving all these handouts to people, $600 stimulus check here, $1,200 stimulus check here, now $1,400 in the latest plan under Biden. And so people are getting all this money, and for the most part, they're putting it in the bank because 80% of people in America never lost their job. And so they were continuing to get all their pay, and now the government's just been giving handouts to everyone. And so you have literally in the United States, $1 trillion of extra savings that didn't exist at this time last year. So once our economy fully opens up, and we're way ahead of Europe on vaccinations and things like that, 2021 is going to be a very, very strong economic year in America. But a lot of that is just the transitory effect of having all this extra savings in the economy. Once you get to 2022, 2023, the growth rate will diminish back. And then it'll be a question of, okay, is Biden getting through all his tax increases? Is he re-regulating the economy? Is he stamping out energy production? Biden has all these bad policies. They won't stop the economy from growing rapidly in the short run because you have all this extra savings, but they will undermine the economy's growth in the long run. Now, whether the growth is so slow in the long run that we fall down to European levels, who knows? Because Europe will be doing additional bad policy probably at the same time. Which maybe the lesson is we both need to move to Australia or New Zealand.
And then I think it's still an optimistic scenario. You say it's possible to have a good economic policy if we do the right decisions and not raise taxes in the US, and also that Europe can continue to catch up, because in the 2000s, with EU enlargement, with getting many competitive countries into the European Union, we were actually catching up a bit, at least, until the great financial crisis. And now the last 12 years were difficult for us. But we are 450 million people here. And I see the last 4 years, if I may ask this question as well, it was a bit complicated, our relation with America. Do you think that also in the libertarian, in the conservative movement, in the free market movement, there is a kind of possibility for a rapprochement with the European Union, because we have a lot of people who want a pro-American Europe, and they are your allies, and that also many of them will watch maybe this video now. And I also ask you personally, will you stay engaged for tax reform, economic reform from Estonia to Bulgaria, from Kosovo to Bosnia? And what's your conclusion and outlook for the 2020s?
Well, I will continue to fight for economic liberty in the United States, in Europe, in any place in the world that wants to hear that message. I want to help out. The question you asked is much more complicated, though. It involves things like, will the Europeans and the United States come together in terms of dealing with China and Russia? Will the Americans and the Europeans get together on free trade agreements? And if they are free trade agreements, are they actually free trade, or are they simply Trojan horses for regulatory harmonization? I have great faith that the people of the United States and the people of Europe can continue to cooperate and be friends and visit each other and do business with each other. What worries me is that our governments are going to make that more difficult, with more taxes, more spending, more regulation, more barriers to growth and opportunity. So the issue has never been the people of the world or the people of the United States or the people of Europe. The problem has always been that we sometimes have governments that just do bad things for shallow, selfish political reasons.
So let's hope there will be much more tax reform coming in the coming years. I'm optimistic actually that there will be some lower taxes in Europe, because people understand now, and also governments, we need lower taxes to have growth after the corona, because now we are sitting paralyzed 1.5 years. And I hope there will be a growth agenda possible in the 2020s together with America, also with a free trade agreement. And because, if you allow me, it's today the day when in 2004, 7 new countries have joined NATO. It's a special celebration day, obviously, that we are united in the same alliance, and that this enlargement was so successful in the last decade. So I would like to thank you very much, Dan, for your time, and also for your leadership and for your contribution the last 20 years for tax reform, for economic reform. And I hope that moment when Corona allows, you will come again to support the reform movements in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and also in Western Europe. And there will be better times ahead for economic reform and also for growth in America and in the European Union.
I think we'll be seeing each other at events in the future.
Thanks a lot. I will now close the recording.